Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Better off, I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Better off, I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face do?
All right, good evening. Here we are. Where's my light? There we go. Whatever. You didn't come to look at my beautiful face anyway. So, all right, we are on chapter 9 of Atlantis and the Kingdom of the Neanderthals. So, I better be reading about some damn Neanderthals in this chapter. There are only 12 chapters. So, I don't know. So far, we've barely had any mention of them. So, here we go. Enoch's Burning Mountains. Wait a minute. Yeah, okay, sounds good. All right. In the first 2 centuries of the Christian era, A strange work called the Book of Enoch was widely read and was assumed to be a part of the Old Testament. I think that early readers saw it as a strange kind of adventure story in which the hero, the prophet Enoch, is taken by angels on a tour of the heavens, including a place very like hell. It also had a certain scandal appeal, since its rebel angels, called the Watchers, decided to try out the delights of sex with earthly women and begat on them a race of unruly giants. Then, for no reason that has ever been discovered, the Book of Enoch vanished. Was it suppressed by the Church? Whatever the reason, it had soon acquired the reputation of being the kind of book that should not be left out where the children could get a hold of it. It was rediscovered toward the end of the 18th century when a Scotsman named James Bruce found it in a monastery in Abyssinia, now Ethiopia. Bruce was a Freemason of the Canongate Lodge of Kilwinning, and his quest may have been inspired by a romantic desire to track down the Ark of the Covenant, which one tradition claims to have been brought there. Bruce made his way to Gondar, Gondar, the capital of Abyssinia, on Lake Tana, and found an extraordinary people who might have been descended from the badly behaved giants of the Book of Enoch. They ate raw steaks sliced straight off a living cow, had the testicles of their enemies hanging from their lances, and broke off in the midst of feasts to have sex on the floor. Bruce, who was huge and bearded, found favor with the king and was appointed a military commander. In due course he did some exploring, writing to what his guide assured him was the source of the White Nile, but which actually turned out to be only the source of the lesser Blue Nile. Okay. In a monastery, he came upon an epic called the Kebra Nagast, Book of the Glory of Kings, which told how King Solomon fathered a child with the Queen of Sheba, who had her capital in Abyssinia. Their son finally returned to Abyssinia, taking the Ark of the Covenant with him. In the same monastery, Bruce discovered the Book of Enoch, which was believed to be written by the prophet Enoch, the grandson of Adam and great-grandfather of Noah. In fact, it was written about 200 BC, but its description of 7 burning mountains that descended out of the sky and fell into the sea, causing a flood, was believed by Professor Alexander Tolman to be based on a tradition about the comet of 7600 BC. Since the flood is an important event in the Freemasons' version of ancient history, Bruce must have felt he had stumbled on something that would make him famous among his fellow Masons. He brought the book back with him to London, where his tales of his uninhibited hosts were received with the deep skepticism of envious stay-at-homes. Dr. Johnson virtually called him a liar. His great book, Travels to Discover the Source of the Nile, was also badly received, although it is impossible to feel much sympathy, since Bruce had employed a poverty-stricken clergyman as his amanuensis on a promise of later payment, then tried to fob him off with 5 guineas. Bruce, thoroughly embittered, died at the age of 64 in 1794 after tripping on the stairs and falling on his head. The Book of Enoch was finally translated into English in 1821, just in time to catch the Romantic Revolution, with its fascination for rebel angels and forbidden couplings. At that point in my research, I came upon Uriel's Machine by Christopher Knight and Robert Lomas, and was fascinated by their account of the section in the Book of Enoch called the Book of the Heavenly Luminaries, which is basically a treatise on astronomy. Enoch is taken on a journey by angels to a land in northerly latitudes. The only clue to its whereabouts is that in this latitude the day is longer than the night by a 1/9 part, and the day amounts exactly to 10 parts, and the night to 8 parts. They concluded that this wintry land is between about 51 and 59 degrees longitude, within which we find Stonehenge in Wiltshire, Newgrange in Ireland, Callanish in the Hebrides, and various other prehistoric observatories. These were built by the people known as the Grooved Ware people, after their ceramics. Is it coincidence, Lomas and Knight ask, that in a chapter of the Book of Enoch dealing with astronomy, the latitudes of several prehistoric observatories is given? At a certain point in this chapter, Enoch is transported toward a mountain of hard flint rock in the west. Quote, "And I saw 6 portals in which the sun rises, and 6 portals in which the sun sets, and the moon rises and sets. Also many windows to the right and left of these portals." End quote. Lomas and Knight were reminded of Stonehenge with its portals between the stone uprights of the trilithons. In the early 1960s, the British astronomer Gerald Hawkins had started to investigate the possibility that Stonehenge might be a kind of Stone Age computer constructed to calculate the moment of sunrise and moonrise over an 18.6-year cycle. His Stonehenge Decoded became an immediate bestseller, although some astronomers were unconvinced. In fact, its ideas are now generally accepted, and in the 1970s, the work of Professor Alexander Thom on ancient stone circles lent support to Hawkins' theory. The basic notion is that by standing in the center of the circle, you can face the sunrise or moonrise and foretell the season according to its position behind the markers. Lomas and Knight decided to try and construct a Uriel machine on a Yorkshire hilltop. In fact, what amounted to a simple observatory. They returned repeatedly to take their observations of sunrise or sunset from the center of the ring to the horizon and stuck markers in place. They persisted for a year and ended with 2 curved rows of posts facing one another, and they learned as ancient henge builders had learned, that the year does not divide neatly into 4 by solstices and equinoxes, because the Earth's orbit around the sun is an ellipse. There are 182 sunrises from the winter to the summer solstice, but 183 from the summer to the winter solstice, and there is the same disparity between the spring to the autumn equinoxes. Their observations enabled them to learn why the ancient monument builders, these Stone Age Einsteins, had chosen as their unit of length what Alexander Thom called the megalithic yard, 32.64 inches. In fact, Thom admitted he had doubled the basic unit he found in all the megalithic sites, 16.32 inches, to bring it closer to our modern yard. Lomas and Knight found that their machine registered the length of the year as 366 days between one winter solstice and another, and this led them to fix a megalithic degree, a 366th portion of the Earth's revolution. They set their posts a megalithic degree apart and found that a star took 3.93 minutes to move from one upright to the next. The megalithic builders almost certainly used a pendulum as their clock. The time a pendulum takes to complete one swing, of course, determined by its length. Lomas and Knight discovered that for the pendulum to swing 366 times in 3.93 minutes, it had to be exactly 16.32 inches long. This is obviously why the Stone Age Einsteins chose 16.32 inches as their basic unit. Lomas and Knight had solved the problem that baffled Thom. But Uriel's machine, amounting in effect to a primitive wood henge of posts, could not only be used as a calculator of sunrises and moonrises, but as an observatory for measuring comets. it could determine quite simply whether a comet was on course to hit the Earth. Lomas and Knight suggested that this was an important part of the purpose of these early observatories. 2 post holes in the Stonehenge car park aligned east-west indicate that the earliest Stonehenge was set up about 8000 BC, more than 3 centuries before the impact of Tolman's comet, which left a layer of sand over Scotland and seashells on top of Snowdon. There is also archaeological evidence that 2 more post holes were set up 1,000 years later. The discovery of Lomas and Knight answers critics of the megalithic yard who protest that it is highly unlikely that there could have been a common measure used over thousands of square miles and dozens of centuries. They were thinking in terms of a megalithic yard made out of iron or wood and hopefully copied by everyone else. In fact, all primitive man had to do was to set up 2 wooden posts on a hill with a megalithic degree between 2 of them and adjust their pendulum so it swung 366 times as a star moved between one post and the next. The problem would then be a megalithic yard long. The pendulum would then be a megalithic yard long. All of this came into clearer focus when I stumbled upon a book called Historical Metrology by A.E. Berriman, an engineer with an obsession about weights and measures. Berriman points out that the basic Greek measurement is the stade, from which the word stadium derives, which is about the length of a football pitch, 185 meters. And amazingly enough, there are precisely 216,000 stade in the polar circumference of the Earth. That happens to be 60 times 60 times 60, or 360 times 60. It is easy to see. Okay, anyway. It is easy to see at a glance that each degree of the Earth's circumference must be 60 stades long. A degree is made up of 60 minutes, so each minute is 1 stade long. A minute is made up of 60 seconds, so each second is a 60th of a Greek stade, and this happens to be 100 Greek feet. This is staggering, for the classical Greeks did not know the size of the Earth until Eratosthenes worked it out around 250 BC with the aid of a deep well in Syene, I guess, Syene. Yet their measuring system proves that they took their stade, from some civilization that did know the size of the Earth. The likeliest candidate would seem to be the Sumerians, who invented the minute with 60 seconds and the hour with 60 minutes. Excuse me. And their hour was 60 minutes. But the Sumerians were not great seafarers, so it seems unlikely that they discovered the size of the Earth. Hapgood's ancient sea kings, that is to say the Atlanteans, seem a more likely candidate. Lomas and Knight had joined the Freemasons out of curiosity. They wanted to know about the origins of its rituals. It is generally assumed that Freemasonry dates back to the guilds of the Middle Ages, a kind of trade union of the builders of cathedrals like Chartres and St. Denis. But close study of its rituals convinced Lomas and Knight that they are far older, dating back to the Jerusalem church in the time of Jesus and his brother James, and that the traditions of Freemasonry are older still, extending back to the flood of 9600 BC. Such a notion is hard to accept. If memories of the flood can be found in the myths of the Indians of Western Canada, then there is no reason why they should not have been preserved in the religious traditions of the Middle East and descended via the Hebrews and then the Christians. Lomas and Knight were particularly intrigued by one of Scotland's most remarkable religious monuments, Rosslyn Chapel, near Edinburgh. I visited this when Joy and I were in Edinburgh in May 1996. It had been built by a Templar named William St. Clair in the mid-15th century, and was an amazing place, seeming pagan rather than Christian. The walls and pillars were covered with sculptures of vines and a riot of carved flowers and fruits, and the pagan figure known as the Green Man seemed to be everywhere. What was he doing in a Christian church? In mythology, he represents the rebirth of vegetation every spring, and pagan festivals revolved around him. In my book Mysteries, written 20 years earlier, I had discussed the ancient religion of the moon goddess Diana, which had been driven out by Christianity, yet refused to die. As noted earlier, an eccentric scholar named Margaret Murray had even suggested that witchcraft was really a religion based on this ancient worship of Diana, and that witch trials in which the devil is described as having presided over a witch's sabbat were really pagan fertility rituals presided over by a high priest dressed as the god Pan, with a goat's feet and horns. I found myself wondering if William St. Clair, or Sinclair, as it was spelled later, the man who had built Rosslyn, was as pious a Christian as he was supposed to be. There was obviously some mystery attached to the place. To begin with, there could be no possible doubt about the representation of sweet corn or of the plant called aloes cactus, also a native of America, which looks rather like a lily and has a bitter flavor. But Rosslyn had been built half a century before Columbus discovered America. On the train back to Cornwall, I read a book I had bought in the Rosslyn bookshop, The Hiram Key, by Robert Lomas and Christopher Knight, which centered around Rosslyn. It reinforced my suspicion that William St. Clair may have been the guardian of some curious and non-Christian mystery. I have that book, by the way, and it is one that I want to read on this stream at some point. Modern Freemasons are inclined. Oh, here comes the yawning. Are inclined to believe that their odd ceremony of initiation, with a noose around the neck, a slipper on one foot, and the other trouser leg rolled up to the knee, and a series of incomprehensible questions and answers, are pure invention. Lomas and Knight came to believe that they are, in fact, a secret code. They concluded that Freemasonry can trace its origins back to the medieval organization known as the Knights Templar, and through them to the Flood. The Templars are so called because their original headquarters was in the basement of Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem, or rather the remains of the temple, which was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70, only 4 years after Herod had rebuilt it. Jerusalem fell to Christian knights in 1099 as a result of the First Crusade. 20 years later, 9 French knights from the area of Troyes approached King Baldwin approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem and told him they had sworn to protect the roads and make them safe for Christian pilgrims. They asked if they could establish a home on the Temple Mount, and Baldwin gave them a plot of land that included the temple's basement, which they turned into a stable. But oddly enough, the 9 knights showed no sign of organizing themselves to protect pilgrims, and in any case, 9 men could hardly have formed an effective patrol. Instead, they spent the next 7 years excavating their stable and scarcely ever ventured outside. They were obviously looking for something. One of their tunnels was found by Israeli archaeologists in the 1970s. But searching for what? When the Romans destroyed the temple, they carried off its treasures. Could there have been the remains of that treasure concealed under the temple? Whatever they were searching for, they do not seem to have found it. And in 1126, 7 years after starting their excavations, Hugh de Payen, the leader of the knights, returned to France. It looked as if the attempt to found an order had been a failure. Then a rescuer appeared. Bernard of Clairvaux, later Saint Bernard, was a Cistercian, and one of France's most powerful churchmen, even though he firmly refused to be promoted above the rank of abbot. He was also the nephew of one of the 9 knights, André de Montbard, and Montbard had accompanied Payen back to France. 2 years later, a synod was convened in the town of Troyes, whose purpose was to persuade the church to back the founding of the Order of Knights Templar, and this came about in 1128, when the Order of the Poor Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon was founded, and made answerable only to the Pope. And with the support of St. Bernard, recruits and money poured in until the Templars became the wealthiest order in Europe. The Second Crusade was initiated by Bernard of Clairvaux after the fall of Edessa in 1144, but it ended in failure. The Muslims under Saladin, I just noticed he spelled Moslems, Moslems, under Saladin, were to recapture Jerusalem in 1187, and during the next century, 7 more crusades failed to restore power to the Christians. The fall of Acre in 1291 completed their defeat, and the Knights Templar lost their raison d'être. Raison d'être. Sorry, got hung up on the French. But they did not lose their power or their wealth, based partly on exemption from taxes. With the new Grand Master Jacques de Molay, they licked their wounds on the island of Cyprus and wondered what to do next. The problem was that Cyprus was insecure, with the Muslims raiding Limassol and taking captives who had to be ransomed. The Templars considered returning to France, but there were problems. The king, Philip the Fair, 1265 to 1314, was in conflict with Pope Boniface the Eighth, and since the Templars regarded the Pope as their master, their return to France would be unwelcome to the king. In fact, the whole order was unwelcome to the king, who felt they were, like their papal master, arrogant nuisances. This may have been because he had once applied to join them and been rejected. It was Philip who won this round. When the Pope threatened to depose Philip, the king denounced Boniface as a heretic and finally had him taken prisoner in his own house. Boniface died soon after being rescued. When his successor, Boniface IX, showed signs of taking up the struggle where Boniface VIII left off, Philip arranged to have him poisoned. Then he had his own candidate, Archbishop Bertrand de Got of Bordeaux, placed on the papal throne. Philip laid down a number of preconditions for supporting Bertrand's candidacy. One of these was that the new pope should move the seat of the papacy to France, but another precondition was held in reserve and has never been revealed. It was almost certainly that the Pope should not oppose his plan to arrest the Templars and seize their money. Bertrand became Pope Clement V in 1305, and the king immediately began to plan one of the most amazing coups in history. It was to arrest all the Templars, 15,000 of them, now living in France, and accuse them of heresy. It could be compared to a modern king plotting to arrest all of the officers in the army, the navy, and the air force. What is so incredible is that it succeeded. Sealed orders went out about 4 weeks before the swoop, and the Templars were arrested on Friday, October 13th, 1307. The Templars were accused of homosexuality, worshipping a demon named Baphomet, and spitting on the cross. Under appalling tortures, such as being held over red-hot braziers, many confessed. The Grand Master Jacques de Molay himself confessed, but at their sentencing on March 18, 1314, Molay withdrew his confession, declaring that it had been forced from him by torture. The king was so enraged at having his plans thwarted that he immediately ordered Molay and his friend Geoffrey de Charny, who also withdrew his confession, to be roasted alive over a slow fire. This happened on the following day on an island in the Seine called the Ile de Palais. It is said that Molay called upon the king and the pope to meet him before the throne of God within a year. Within 3 months both were dead, Philip gored by a boar during hunting, Clement of a fever. But not all of the Templars were captured. Their fleet was moored at La Rochelle, and on the day before the swoop, the ships sailed away and vanished. The commander of one of these ships was the Seigneur de Gotte, who was related to the Pope, Bertrand de Gotte. It looks as if Bertrand had tipped him off about the forthcoming coup. We know what happened to at least one of the ships. It was commanded by a knight named Henri de Saint Clair, who settled in Scotland, and in due course one of his descendants built Rosslyn Chapel. Perhaps the most interesting speculation to emerge from all this is that other ships of the Templar fleet sailed across the Atlantic nearly 2 centuries before Columbus, and one later returned to Scotland. It is hard otherwise to explain the sweet corn and aloes carved on the walls of Rosslyn Chapel. But there is another question equally baffling. If the Templars' fleet knew about the existence of America, where did they learn about it? They must have read manuscripts or seen maps that told them of its existence, maps of the ancient sea kings. Where would they have found them? The obvious possibility is buried in the basement of the temple in Jerusalem, when the Templars were living there and excavating the stables. And who would have hidden them there? Clearly not the Jewish priests, who were mainly concerned with hiding the temple treasures from the Romans. However, in the year of the Jewish revolt, AD 66, there were others who were equally anxious to preserve their treasures. The Essenes were a religious sect who had withdrawn into the wilderness to signalize their disapproval of Israel's priestly dynasty, the Hasmoneans and the Maccabees. These were descendants of the guerrilla warrior Judas Maccabeus, who 2 centuries earlier had led the revolt against the Syrian overlords. When Judas was killed in battle, his brother Jonathan took over. In due course, he became high priest and founded a dynasty. Orthodox Jews were outraged, for the law stated that high priests should be descended from Aaron, and they formed an opposition party, the Pharisees. But the Essenes, led by a prophet who called himself the teacher of righteousness, went further and set up their own community at Qumran in the desert near the Dead Sea caves. They seem to have lived in tents and used the caves for storerooms. Nearly 2,000 years later, many Essene scriptures were found in the caves and became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Lomas and Knight accept the widely held theory that Jesus was an Essene and that his younger brother James succeeded to the title of Teacher of Righteousness. Jesus was crucified after an attempt to raise a revolt against the Romans, and priests threw James from the wall of the temple, then stoned him to death. But when the emperor Vespasian came with his son Titus to suppress the Jewish revolt of AD 66, the Essenes prepared to fight to the death, and Lomas and Knight argue hid their most valuable scrolls in the temple. Most died in their fight against the invaders, and Titus razed the temple to the ground and carried off its treasure to Rome. But the tradition of the hidden scrolls was somehow preserved. We shall consider the most startling theory of how this came about in the next chapter. And when the church called for a crusade to conquer the Holy Land, heirs to their tradition seem to have seen their opportunity to regain the lost scriptures. I'm just wondering how much farther we've got. Jesus. Holy shit. Really? God damn. Holy kerfuck, Batman. We've got almost 30 pages to go. All right. Might not have time to do another stream tonight. Their first priority would be to get them translated. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Oh, when the church called for a crusade to conquer the Holy Land, heirs to their tradition seem to have seen the opportunity to regain the lost scriptures. Their first priority would be to get them translated. One of the knights, Geoffrey de Saint-Omer, knew an old scholar named Lambert, now known as Lambert of Saint-Omer, and probably took some of the scrolls to him around AD 1119. The evidence is that Lambert is now best known for a copy of a drawing called the Heavenly Jerusalem, which shows all the basic symbols of Freemasonry, the twin pillars, the three Masonic squares, and compasses, 5 centuries before it is supposed to have been founded in Europe. Lomas and Knight point out that the notion of a heavenly Jerusalem, or New Jerusalem, was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls based on Ezekiel's vision. Their argument is too complex to summarize here, but they conclude, quote, "With the discovery of the heavenly Jerusalem scroll, we are now certain that the Templars did find the secrets of their order inscribed upon the scrolls buried by the Nazarenes, or Essenes of Qumran." If the scroll was one of the parchments found under the temple, it would confirm that Freemasonry was known to the Essenes. Now, Lomas and Knight turned their attention to Palestine in the time of Jesus, and discoveries began to come thick and fast. To begin with, it soon became clear that the Christian Jesus of Nazareth and the Jesus known by his contemporaries were two completely different figures. In fact, the town of Nazareth did not even exist in Jesus' day. Jesus was known as Jesus the Nazarene, not the Nazarene. What? I don't understand that sentence. Jesus was known as, quote unquote, Jesus the Nazarene, not the Nazarene. I don't get what they're trying to say there, or what he's trying to say. And the Nazarenes were what we today might describe as Jewish Puritans. They were strict vegetarians, rejected animal sacrifice, and refused to recognize the divine inspiration of Moses. Charles Gignebert, I don't know, says that in certain respects they resembled the Essenes, but Lomas and Knight argue convincingly that they were the Essenes. Lomas and Knight were also discovered that Nazarenes still survive in southern Iraq in a sect called the Mandeans. Are they Christians? No, not quite. Their devotion is not to Jesus, but to his cousin John the Baptist. Their opinion of Jesus is extremely low. They regard him as a rebel and heretic who betrayed secrets that had been entrusted to him. In a book called A History of Secret Societies, Archon Dural comments that the Mandeans, quote, follow an ancient form of Gnosticism which practices initiation, ecstasy, and some rituals which have been said to resemble those of the Freemasons. Moreover, the Mandeans practice a special handshake and have a ritual in which, as in Freemasonry, the candidate rises from the dead. Lomas and Knight felt that this amounts to evidence that Freemasonry is a great deal older than the 17th century, and it is difficult not to agree with them. Now we come to their now we come to their startling and highly unconventional views on Christianity. They argue that Jesus was not simply a preacher of universal love. He wanted to get rid of the Romans and was prepared to lead a revolt to do it. His views outraged many people. Quote, everything points the same way. Jesus, or Yahshua ben Joseph, as he was known to his contemporaries, was a deeply unpopular man in Jerusalem and at Qumran. His agenda was much more radical than his family and most other Qumranians could understand. As we will go on to show, all the evidence suggests that most people backed James, including Mary and Joseph. The Essenes, Lomas, and Knight state accepted Jesus and John the Baptist as the two messiahs, the two pillars, that are so basic to Freemasonry. Qumran means an arched doorway, and the arch that joins the pillars is God. With the death of John the Baptist, Lomas and Knight argue Jesus became more radical, and he also took on his cousin John's role of the second pillar. This upset the Qumranians. I must stress that Lomas and Knight cite historical texts for even their most outrageous assertions. Jesus spent the period of his ministry, which was only a year, gathering followers as he preached in remote places where the Romans would pay no attention. Then he decided it was time for action. He rode into Jerusalem on an ass to fulfill a prediction of the prophet Zechariah that the king would arrive on a donkey. Then he went to the temple and caused a riot, attacking the money changers. After that, he retreated to the nearby village of Bethany and waited for the revolution. Excuse me. Gotta breathe more. The Romans issued a wanted poster for Jesus, which still survives, describing him as short, about 4'6", bald-headed, and humpbacked. His brother James was arrested first, then Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane, just across the valley from the temple. From there he would have been able to see the two pillars of the eastern gate, with the arch that joined them, the two pillars of the New Jerusalem that were, in effect, himself. The implication seems to be that he was not expecting to be arrested. He had struck the first blow, an act that he believed would soon echo across all Judea and bring people flocking to his banner. Then, with the help of Yahweh, he would do for his people what Judas Maccabeus had done nearly 2 centuries earlier. But he had underestimated the Romans and their Jewish underlings. They decided to nip this rebellion in the bud. Wow, I am struggling. I need to... Maybe I'll stand up again like I did last time. I don't know why Well, I just ate. That's why. That's what it is. I ate, and now my guts are taking up all my blood flow. So, yeah, bring this up a bit. Ugh. Let's see. An old friend of mine, Hugh Schonfield, an eminent Jewish scholar, was firmly convinced that Jesus did not die on the cross, but was given a drug that made him appear to be dead. He argues this case convincingly in The Passover Plot. Henry Lincoln, Richard Lay, and Michael Bejant take a similar line in the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. I also do have that book. I don't know about The Passover Plot. I'm not sure if I have yet. So Jesus was crucified at the age of 33 and his body placed in a specifically prepared tomb. But 2 days later, the body had disappeared and some of the disciples saw him alive. But the date is a matter of dispute. Jesus was almost certainly born in 7 BC. This means that the millennium was actually in 1993. The next step in the story is the coming of Saul, a Romanized Jew. He changed his name to Paul when he became a Roman citizen, and not, as usually stated, when he became a Christian convert. Then he was given the job of stamping out the remains of the Jewish freedom movement. He began to do this about 10 years after Jesus' crucifixion, in AD 43, and among his first victims were the sects of Mandeans, who ended in Iraq. 17 years later, he was struck blind on the road to Damascus and became the chief exponent of Christianity. This would not have been Damascus in Syria, where he would have had no authority, but probably Qumran, who also referred to as Damascus. Lummus and Knight suggest he was going there to persecute Jesus' brother James, now known as James the Just, and it was Paul who, on recovering his sight, became romantically enthralled by the doctrine that would later be labeled Christianity. James was probably startled when the persecutor came to Qumran and begged to know all about his brother Jesus. What James and other members of the community told Paul seems to have inspired him to create his own religion based upon Jesus. When in due course the Qumranians realized what the new convert was preaching, they nicknamed him the Spouter of Lies. According to Paul, there are two versions of the life of Jesus, Paul's own and that of James the Just. Paul's own version was that Jesus was the Son of God and had died on the cross to save man from the consequences of the sin of Adam. This version was designed to appeal to Gentiles, particularly those, like the Romans, who valued Greek culture. Paul's Jesus was a kind of Greek god who had died to guarantee his followers entry into heaven. James and his Nazarenes were also known as Messianists, for they were still awaiting the Messiah, and some seemed to believe that the martyred revolutionary Jesus would return from death and lead a military revolt against the Romans. These extremists also became known as Zealots. The Messiah they awaited would be an Orthodox Jew like Judas Maccabeus. They also believed, as Jesus had done, that the end of the world was about to arrive and that they alone would be saved. But Paul's Christianity, which he carried abroad to the Gentiles, had more appeal. I note in A Criminal History of Mankind, quote, "This new version of Christianity appealed to Gentiles as much as Jews. Anyone of any sensitivity only had to look at the Rome of Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero to understand just what Paul meant about the fall of man. These sex-mad drunkards were a living proof that something had gone wrong, and the Roman matron who took up prostitution for pleasure revealed that Eve had fallen just as far as Adam. The world was nauseated by Roman brutality, Roman materialism, Roman licentiousness. Christianity sounded a deeper note. It offered a vision of meaning and purpose, a vision of seriousness. For the strong, it was a promise of new heights of awareness. For the weak, it was a message of peace and reconciliation, of rest for the weary, of reward for the humble. And for everyone, it promised an end to the kingdom of Caesar with its crucifixions, floggings, and arbitrary executions. The Christians hoped it was a promise of the end of the world. Ironically, it was the Jewish revolt of AD 66 that led to the triumph of Paul's Christianity over James's Messianism, and it was sparked, at least in part, according to the Jewish historian Josephus, by the murder of James by priests in AD 62. Nero was forced to send his general Vespasian to put down the revolt. When Nero committed suicide, Vespasian was proclaimed emperor by his troops. Vespasian returned to Rome and left his son Titus to continue the siege of Jerusalem, which fell in September AD 70. The temple was burned, the rebels, including the Messianists, massacred, and the treasures of the temple carried back to Rome. And now there were no Messianists. Paul's religion of the crucified Savior, which he had carried abroad, had no rivals and went on to conquer the world. Christianity was such a highly successful religion because it preached the end of the world. Jesus has said that Armageddon, the final battle between good and evil, would take place within the lifetime of people then listening to him. Assuming some of his listeners were children, that meant the event would be expected by about AD 90. Jesus was, by modern standards, suffering from delusions when he believed that God had told him that the end of the world was about to take place, just as the Jews were suffering from delusions when they started the revolt with the total certainty that Yahweh would not allow his temple to be invaded by foreigners. But when AD 90 came and went without Armageddon, no one noticed. To begin with, the Christians were being persecuted by one of the most vicious Roman emperors so far, Vespasian's other son, Domitian, who insisted on being addressed as Lord God and killed thousands of Christians for refusing to accept his divinity. He was assassinated in AD 96. For the next 2 centuries, the fortunes of the Christians varied, but as often as not, they were persecuted. Emperors found it convenient to have someone to throw to the lions, for the amusement of the populace. Since the Christians were mostly slaves and the downtrodden, they were regarded with little sympathy by those who were better off. When Pliny the Younger decided to find out about Christianity by questioning his 2 young slave girls, who happened to be deaconesses, he found it perfectly natural to torture them. He was later apologetic about this, reporting that he had found nothing against them except that they were in the grip of a distorted and boundless superstition. On the whole, Lomas and Knight would concur. Pope Leo X also agreed. He is quoted by Lomas and Knight as saying, quote, "It has served us well, this myth of Christ." End quote. In the year of AD 312, the persecuted minority called Christians could hardly believe their luck when the Emperor Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the empire. Constantine's own explanation is that he saw a cross in the sky before he fought the crucial battle of the Milvian Bridge, and the words, "In this sign shall ye conquer." That story is thrown into doubt by the fact that Constantine himself did not become a Christian. He remained a follower of the sun god Sol Invictus, instituted by the Emperor Aurelian. But he did conquer. He was fighting his brother Maxentius, and threw Maxentius's body into the Tiber. And the Christians were in the position of some poor relation who suddenly becomes sole heir to immense wealth. Constantine's conversion seems to have been entirely political. In the previous century, there had been more than 70 emperors in 70 years, all mostly assassinated. All over the empire, the barbarians were in revolt. The Emperor Diocletian seized power in AD 284 and held the empire together by sheer strength of will and brute force. He flung bands of iron around the empire and ordered towns and villages that garrisoned his troops to feed them for nothing. His people were taxed as never before. Even so, he had to appoint 3 other emperors to help him rule the empire. But when he decided to retire and remove the bands of steel, the empire immediately began to fall apart. Something had to be done, and it was Constantine, son of one of Diocletian's fellow emperors, who saw how to do it. Perhaps the inspiration came to him before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, and explains why he said he had seen a vision. He realized that what the empire needed was not a vast army, but a new religion. His choice of Christianity was probably due to the fact that his mother, Helena, Helena, I live in Helena, I was stupid. His choice of Christianity was probably due to the fact that his mother, Helena, a British princess, was a Christian. Although Christianity had spread through his empire, it was very much a minority religion. Only 1 in 10 of his subjects was a Christian. On the other hand, there were a few Christians in virtually every town and village, and if he handed them power, then he had a supporter in every town and village, and a fellow emperor in every city big enough to have a bishop. Wow, completely lost it there. Sorry. It worked, but then Constantine found himself with another headache. These gentle, peace-loving Christians began to assail one another as violently as the Jews of 3 centuries earlier. The cause of contention was much the same as in Jerusalem. Half the Christians regarded the other half as collaborators. The Emperor Diocletian had persecuted Christians and ordered them to hand over their holy books, and many had preferred that to martyrdom. Now the non-compromisers wanted to see them punished. When a council of bishops held at Arles, Arles, failed to heal the breach, the harassed emperor fled to Byzantium, no doubt regretting his folly in handing power to those squabbling fanatics. But Byzantium was just as bad. There, the main cause of contention was the view of an Alexandrian priest named Arius, who had made the apparently unexceptionable observation that Jesus, while the Son of God, was not God himself. But by that time, Paul's romantic view of Jesus had taken such a hold that this sensible and moderate notion was regarded as blasphemous. Constantine decided to put a stop to this irritating dissension once and for all. In 325, he called a council at Nicaea in Turkey and summoned church leaders from all over the empire. Then he sat down with them and more or less ordered them to decide exactly what constituted Christianity. Arius lost the argument, and his views were condemned as the Arian heresy. Or Arian. Okay. He was sent into exile, and Christianity was defined by the Nicene Creed, which stated that Jesus was one in being with God the Father, while the Holy Ghost came a poor third, since it simply proceeded from the Father and Son. And so Jesus, whether he liked it or not, was transformed into a God, a notion that, as an Orthodox Jew, would have shocked him profoundly. Constantine, who was not a Christian and could not have cared less what they decided, was delighted that they had made up their minds and would stop killing one another and undermining the security of the state. His daughter, Constantia, was less sure and intervened to have Arius recalled from exile and reinstated. His mother, Helena, proved invaluable, for she discovered the true cross, complete with the plaque about the King of the Jews. The spot where Jesus was crucified was identified, and so was his tomb. Helena also identified the spot where God spoke to Moses from a burning bush, and dozens of other places mentioned in Holy Scripture, in all of which she had a church built. Naturally, all became tourist attractions. This was just a beginning. As Lomas and Knight put it, quote, the early Roman Church set about the task of destroying everything that did not meet its required dogma. Truth was unimportant. What the Church wanted to be was so, and everything contradictory to that was removed, end quote. In 415 AD, a screaming Christian mob led by the patriarch Cyril burned down the library of Alexandria. The scholar Hypatia, one of the chief mathematicians of her day, was stripped naked and her skin flayed from her bones with abalone shells. Cyril was in due course canonized. And so the Roman Catholic Church continued where the Caesars left off and even forged a document called the Donation of Constantine, which claimed that the Church should have absolute authority not just in spiritual matters, but in affairs of this world too. The Church had tasted power and it liked it, and was determined to hang on to it. Understandably, the Church totally rejected this view of the founding of Christianity and continued to do so virtually unopposed until 1947. Then a discovery made in caves close to Qumran on the Dead Sea provided a challenge that threatened to shake it to its foundation. Shake it to its foundation. Where is it? There we go. At some date in early 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy searching on the cliffs at Qumran for a lost goat found an opening that was invisible from below. He threw a stone, and there was a sound of breaking pottery. So he clambered in and dropped onto the floor of a cave. It contained a number of earthenware jars, each about 2 feet tall. One of the jars proved to contain leather rolls wrapped in crumbling linen. For poor Arabs, the jars were more valuable than the contents, so several jars were removed and used for water, and some of the scrolls burned as fuel. When one of them reached a Christian shopkeeper, he in turn showed it to his archbishop. Finally, some scrolls reached an archaeological institute run by Dominicans in Jerusalem, which concluded they were forgeries. It was not until March of the following year that William F. Albright of Johns Hopkins University pronounced that some scrolls dated from around 100 BC. In fact, other ancient scrolls had been discovered 2 years earlier in Nag Hammadi in Egypt, but I shall delay discussion of these until the next chapter. As more Dead Sea Scrolls came to light in Qumran, they were transferred to the Palestine Archaeological Institute, known as the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem. Under the guardianship of the rigid conservative Dominican Father Roland DeVoe, they had still aroused no great interest in the scholarly world, for it was assumed that they were simply ancient copies of known books of the Old Testament, like Isaiah. And as DeVoe recognized their real significance, he also realized that it was in the interest of the Church to keep it that way. For in effect, the Dead Sea Scrolls revealed that the Roman Catholic Church had been built on a foundation of lies. Interesting. Still a lot of pages to go here. In 1954, all this was about to be threatened by a maverick scholar named John M. Allegro, the British nominee of an international team of scholars. To begin with, Allegro naively assumed that he was working with completely objective scholars who would not mind in the least releasing the news that the scrolls proved that Jesus was not the Son of God, but a Jewish rebel. But when it became clear that the incredibly slow pace at which the discoveries were being published was part of a cover-up, and that the chosen material was chosen for its unimportance, he decided to do something about it. Allegro was not the first to realize that the scholars were engaged in skullduggery. Of course, skullduggery, whichever way you prefer to pronounce that. The American literary critic Edmund Wilson wrote an article about the scrolls for the New Yorker in 1955, which was such a success that he decided to write a book. Wilson was a leftist and an anti-Catholic and soon realized what was happening. He pointed out that there seemed to be certain dragging of feet and a tension between the academic team at the Rockefeller Museum and some independent scholars like Professor Andre Dupont Sommer of the Sorbonne, who had pointed out 5 years earlier that the teacher of righteousness, who is described as being crucified in the Dead Sea Scrolls, sounded very like Jesus. He was amazed at the bitterness of the replies of his Catholic opponents. In 1956, John Allegro gave 3 radio talks in the north of England on the scrolls and advised a friend on DeVoe's team not to become a theologian because, quote, by the time I've finished, there won't be any church left for you to join, end quote. His broadcast caused little stir in England, but were picked up by the New York Times, which stated that some of the early Qumran documents seemed to show the origins of Christianity 100 years before Jesus. Time magazine followed with an article called Crucifixion Before Christ. By now, Catholic scholars were in full defensive posture. They had dismissed Edmund Wilson as an ignorant amateur, but a scholar who was a member of the team was more dangerous. Their next move amazed Allegro. They wrote a joint letter to the Times denouncing him and denying his assertions about the teacher and his crucifixion. They claimed that there was nothing out of the sort in their texts. Allegro was baffled that they wanted to go public with the row since it seemed contrary to their whole policy of playing down the scrolls. What he failed to grasp was that this was the first step in a move to totally discredit him. In his naivety, he still thought of himself as a member of the team and continued a friendly, if argumentative, correspondence with DeVoe and others. Then there was the sensitive question of the Copper Scroll. In 1952, there was found in a Qumran cave with writing indented on it. It was in 2 fragments, both rolled up, and was so brittle that it could not be opened. A friend of Allegro, Professor H. Wright Baker of Manchester College, devised a machine for slicing it into strips, and it proved to be a list of treasures from the temple. Again, DeVoe's team was embarrassed. The Essenes were supposed to be enemies of the Sadducees who ran the temple, but this find indicated otherwise. The international team had been insisted that the Essenes were an isolated cult who were irrelevant, that were clearly not so. That's a rough sentence. I think I know what he's trying to say. This was not the only reason DeVoe wanted to keep the scroll secret. If talk of hidden treasure was publicly announced, thousands of Bedouins with spades might descend on Qumran. So Allegro saw the point when told to keep his own counsel, and assuming that it would be published sooner or later, he did as he was asked. He even kept quiet about it in a book he was writing on the Dead Sea Scrolls. But when the official communiqué was finally released in May 1956 and stated that the treasure was probably fictional and in any case was not associated with Qumran, Allegro felt he had been stabbed in the back. Hold on just a second. Ugh, man. Okay, sip. At least the controversy turned Allegro's book, The Dead Sea Scrolls, into a bestseller. So he naturally agreed when the BBC suggested making a program based on it, but when the BBC team arrived at the Rockefeller Museum, they were met with a blank refusal to cooperate. And when told that in that case the program would be made without their help, they admitted that it was not the program they objected to, but Allegro. In spite of all this, the program was completed at the end of 1957, then transmission was delayed until the end of 1959, when it went out in a late-night slot. Allegro assumed, probably rightly, that the BBC had been got at by the international team. It looked as if Allegro had won when he persuaded the Jordanians to nationalize the Rockefeller Museum. They did this at the end of 1966. Then came the Six-Day War of 1967, and Jerusalem became Israeli property, and Israel had no wish to upset the Pope. So the Rockefeller team could dawdle to its heart's content. And now, amazingly, Allegro played straight into the hands of his opponents. Time for yes, it is. Actually, yes. Let's go ahead and take a break. I've got 10, 12 pages left to go, so I'm going to take a quick break and let me know if I'm still getting that double sound, because I did something to try to fix it.
Treading lightly, oh, but I know I still want you with me, even when it's not easy. Feels like we are on the edge now. Wish somebody would tell me how to get us to safety. 'Cause I need you, baby. 'Cause I will make it right, right. Yeah, I am by your side, side. I don't wanna let go of all these memories in my mind. I don't want a goodbye tonight. No, no. All I want is a good time. Feels like no one else is around, but everything is breaking us down. I still need you with me, more than ever now, baby. Feels like this is phasing out now. I know we can mix it up somehow. No matter what you do, just know I'll always be right next to you. 'Cause I will make it right, right. Yeah, I am by your side, side. I don't wanna let go of all these memories in my mind. I don't want a goodbye tonight. No, no. All I want is a good time. All I want is a good time. Yeah, yeah. All I want is a good time. Feels like we are on a tightrope, treading lightly, oh, but I know I still want you with me, even when it's not easy. Feels like we are on the edge now. Wish somebody would tell me how to get us to safety. 'Cause I need you, baby. 'Cause I I will make it right, right. Yeah, I am by your side, side. I don't wanna let go of all these memories in my mind. I don't want a goodbye tonight. No, no, all I want is a good time. Feels like no one else is around, but everything is breaking us down. I still need you with me, more than ever now, baby. Feels like this is phasing out now. I know we can mix it up somehow. No matter what you do, just know I'll always be right next to you. 'Cause I will make it right, right. Yeah, I am by your side, side. I don't wanna let go of all these memories in my mind. I don't want a goodbye tonight.
All right, let's get back to it. I have my adult beverage now. Oh. Okay. And now, amazingly, Allegro played straight into the hands of his opponents. In 1970, he produced a book called The Sacred Mushrooms and the Cross, which argued, on philosophical grounds, that Jesus had never existed. He was a symbol of Godhead evoked by psychedelic mushrooms ingested by some contemporary fertility cult. This sounds preposterous, particularly in view of Allegro's familiarity with Essene scrolls that left no doubt that Jesus, or at least a crucified teacher, was a real person. Neither can this extraordinary aberration be blamed on Allegro's own drug-taking, for he was not even a drinker or smoker. Whatever the reason, Allegro destroyed himself and handed victory to the Rockefeller team. He never regained academic respectability nor popular favor. He died unexpectedly in 1988 at the age of 53. His chief enemy, DeVoe, had been dead since 1972. It is a pity that he was unable to live another 2 years and see the self-destruction of one of the most prominent members of the DeVoe team. The editor in charge of publication, John Strugnell. Like most of the team, Strugnell was violently anti-Semitic, and when in November 1990 the Israelis appointed one of their own scholars, Emmanuel Tov, to act as joint editor of the project to publish the scrolls, Strugnell told an interviewer that he regarded Judaism as, quote, a horrible religion, a Christian heresy, end quote. He added that only solution was a mass conversion of the Jews to Christianity. His remarks were reported worldwide, and within weeks he had been dismissed. The battle for access to the scrolls was not won until September 1963. Then the Huntington Library in California dismayed the Rockefeller team by announcing that it possessed a complete set of photographs of the scrolls which had been commissioned in 1953 before DeVoe had succeeded in establishing his stranglehold. DeVoe's team asked for their return and were ignored, and the Huntington declared that it intended to make microfilm copies available to scholars for as little as $10. So, in effect, the scrolls were finally published. According to Lomas and Knight, the original Jerusalem church, which began with the Essenes, vanished when Titus burned down the temple and slaughtered the Essenes who were left. but the tradition survived in various documents. Lomas and Knight came upon a letter by Clement of Alexandria, a 2nd century theologian, which spoke of a secret gospel and of a secret ceremonies conducted by Jesus himself. We may recall the Mandeans, the Nazarenes, i.e. Essenes, who escaped to Persia before Titus's massacre of rebels who worshipped John the Baptist, regarding Jesus as a traitor and whose rituals resemble those of the Freemasons. Their ceremonies seem to support Lomas and Knight's arguments that Freemasonry can be traced to the Essenes and their Jerusalem church. In other words, the Essenes practiced initiation ceremonies into which only special selected candidates were admitted and which involved a ritual death and resurrection, as in Freemasonry. Soon after the beginning of the Jewish revolt in AD 66, a strange thing had happened, which is still not fully understood by historians. Before Vespasian was sent to Palestine, a Roman named Cestus Gallus arrived with a powerful military force and made his way to Jerusalem, encountering little resistance. The Romans besieged the temple and breached the walls. Then they changed their minds and withdrew. The astounded Jews could only assume that Yahweh had decided to help them, as he had helped the Israelites escape from Egypt. They harassed the retreating Romans and killed around 6,000 of them. Rome soon took its revenge and sent Vespasian, who proceeded to destroy the Jewish cities and towns one at a time, to leave no refuge for the rebels. It took more than 4 years, but ended in Roman victory and Jewish defeat. It is almost certain that it was while Cestus was marching on Jerusalem that the Essenes decided to conceal their holy scriptures. The less important ones they cut into slices and hid in jars in the caves overlooking the Dead Sea, but the most valuable documents they hid beneath the temple. These scrolls, Lomas and Knight speculate, are the ones discovered by the Templars. But William St. Clair built Rosslyn 2 centuries before the first Freemasons were recorded in England. How do we even know that St. Clair was a Freemason? Lomas and Knight uncovered much evidence at Rosslyn, which they describe in their books The Hiram Key and The Second Messiah. But one of the most convincing pieces of evidence is this carving they found on the wall outside Rosslyn. I have the Hiram Key. I don't know if I have The Second Messiah. If I don't, I'm going to look for it. The carving on the outside of Rosslyn. This shows a Freemason ceremony with the candidates blindfolded and with a noose around his neck. The man who holds the rope is a Templar with the cross on his tunic. It leaves no doubt that St. Clair was a Templar and that the Templars were also Freemasons. In fact, Lomas and Knight believe that the building of Rosslyn marks the first appearance of Freemasonry in England. Lomas and Knight began to look into the history of the St. Clairs of Rosslyn. It seemed that William St. Clair was a Norman who came over at around the same time as William the Conqueror in 1066. He was known as William the Seemly. His son was Henry St. Clair, and he went off on the First Crusade in 1095 and fought alongside Hugh de Payenne, marching into Jerusalem with him. And Hugh married Henry's niece, Catherine St. Clair. So the connection of the St. Clairs with the Templars was very close indeed. When the Templars' fleet sailed from La Rochelle in 1307, some Templars went to Scotland, where an abbey named Kilwinning had been built in the first great days of Templar power around 1140. It was just south of Glasgow and was the Templars' major center. This would be a natural refuge, particularly since the St. Clair family lived not far away, in Rosslyn. Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland, had been excommunicated by the Pope, so Templars had nothing to fear in Scotland. Before I move on, there is an illustration here. An outline of the carving at Rosslyn showing a Templar knight initiating a candidate into Freemasonry. So, there we go. Got the noose around his neck. Looks like a Bible in his hand. The cross on the chest. The two pillars. One of the main arguments of the Hiram Key is that Rosslyn Chapel was built in deliberate imitation of Herod's temple, which, remarkably enough, was only about the size of a parish church, and is the home of the precious scrolls which were the most important treasure of the Templars. They argue that even the unfinished outer wall at Rosslyn, which looks as if the building was simply abandoned at that point, was a replica of an unfinished wall in Herod's rebuilding of Solomon's temple. In 1447, while Rosslyn Chapel was being built, there was a fire in the keep of Rosslyn Castle. William St. Clair was frantic until he learned that his chaplain had managed to salvage 4 great trunks full of charters, whereupon, says the record, he became cheerful. Lomas and Knight point out that it sounds odd to value 4 trunks of charters more than his castle keep, not to mention his wife and daughters, who were also inside. But if these trunks contained the secret scrolls from Jerusalem, which would be buried in Rosslyn Chapel, his curious priorities become understandable. All this seems to indicate clearly that William St. Clair was a Freemason and that there is a direct link between the Essenes and Freemasonry. This would also explain why the Catholic Church has always been so hostile to Freemasonry. The Essenes were rebels against the Jewish religious establishment. Jesus himself was a rebel who wanted to lead a revolt against the priests and the Roman occupiers. He was crucified for wholly political reasons. St. Paul invented his own religion, which Shaw characterized as Christianity, and which is still the religion of the Catholic Church. The Templars knew the truth. They rejected the notion that Jesus was the Son of God. That is why they were accused of spitting on the cross and tortured to death. That is why Rosslyn is not a Christian church, but is full of images of the Green Man. But a major question remains. Why is Rosslyn a replica of Solomon's temple? Why is Solomon's temple so central to Freemasons? And why is its architect, Hiram Abief, so important to Freemasonry? In the ceremony of initiation, Hiram's murder by 3 workmen is reenacted, after which the candidate is resurrected. As he is resurrected, certain words are spoken aloud. They sound like gibberish. Ma'at neb men ah, ma'at ba'ah. But Christopher Knight happened to know that ma'at is an ancient Egyptian word. It meant originally ordered and symmetrical, like the base of a temple. Then it came to mean righteousness, truth, and justice. Concepts that play such a central role in Freemasonry. Knight realized that the gibberish, quote unquote, is ancient Egyptian, meaning, quote, great is the master of Ma'at, great is the spirit of Ma'at, end of quote. Okay. Sorry. It seems that Hiram, who came from Tyre, was not just the architect of the temple, but the master builder who directed operations, and he was attacked and killed by 3 of his own workers, who struck him 3 blows, apparently because he refused to divulge the secret signal that would have enabled them to claim a higher rank than they actually possessed, and thus higher wages. It all sounds highly unlikely. Surely workers on the temple could not get away with such a crudely conceived swindle. Lomas and Knight had a strong suspicion that the story of Hiram Abiff concealed some important historical truth. Moreover, why is the ritual of Freemasonry so full of hints that its origin lies in ancient Egypt? Why is the Great Pyramid one of its central symbols? The forefathers of modern America, all Freemasons, were responsible for placing the pyramid symbol on dollar bills. Since there are so many connections between Jews and Egyptians in the Old Testament, Lomas and Knight felt that their answer probably lay in historical events in which both figured, and such events would probably have taken place long before Solomon built the temple. Now, according to the book of Genesis, the Jews came into existence after Jacob had wrestled with the angel, and his name was changed to Israel. His 12 sons gave their names to the 12 tribes of Israel. The date, as we shall see in a moment, seems to have been sometime in the middle of the 16th century BC. 16th century BC. The Jewish historian Josephus had identified the so-called Hyksos or Hyksos or shepherd kings with the Hebrews of the Old Testament. The Hyksos were in fact a mixed group of Semitics and Asiatics who moved into Egypt around 1750 BC, not as warriors but as refugees from drought. They seized power around 1630 BC and ruled until they were thrown out 108 years later, as a result of a revolt that began at Thebes, now Luxor, or Thebes. And although modern scholars do not feel that Josephus was completely accurate, there seems little doubt that the ancestry of the Jews includes the Hyksos. Okay. About 8 pages to go. No, not quite. What do we got? 6 pages to go. So, we're getting there. The Hyksos kings ruled northern Egypt, or Lower Egypt, but Thebes was ruled by a traditional pharaoh, Sequenenre, whose eldest son inaugurated their revolt. Lomas and Knight were inclined to wonder, was there an Egyptian pharaoh to whom the story of Hiram Abiff might apply? Indeed there was, and only one. It was Sequenenre himself. It seemed that the Hyksos pharaoh of this time was called Apophis or Apopi. Christopher Knight remembered a book of Egyptian liturgies called the Book of Overthrowing Apopi, full of magic spells to get rid of him. Moreover, the Hyksos kings increased their unpopularity by worshipping the storm god Set, whom most Egyptians regarded as the god of evil. Interesting, that brings up some memories. When a pharaoh ascended the throne, he went through a ceremony whose purpose was to make him into a god, specifically into Horus, son of Osiris. And when he died, he became Osiris, and there was an important ceremony called the opening of the mouth. When his mouth was levered open with an adze, so his soul could rejoin his fellow gods in heaven and take on the task of interceding for his people. Why should Apopi want to know the secret ceremony? Because after 2 centuries, the Hyksos had been thoroughly Egyptianized. They believed that the ritual would turn the pharaoh into a god. They saw themselves as upstarts, but they wanted to become truly Egyptian. And the pharaoh Apopi naturally wanted to become a god. At that stage, of course, the Hyksos had every reason to assume that they would still be ruling Egypt 1,000 years hence. Sequenenre was murdered with blows on his head. We know that from his mummy. Lomas and Knight include a gruesome photograph of it with gashes on the skull and one eye missing. The person with the most obvious motive for murdering him would be the Hyksos pharaoh Apopi. If Sequenenre was the original of Hiram Abif, then the secret the three murderers tried to force from him would be the ritual to make a newly crowned pharaoh into Horus. In the scenario of Lomas and Knight, based on Masonic ritual, Sequenenre was approached by three men named Jubela, Jubelo, and Jubelum, whose task was to make him divulge the secret ritual. He refused, probably with some angry and contemptuous words. Kings do not like being threatened. Whereupon the three ruffians went beyond their instructions and killed him with 3 blows. This was also a basic part of the Masonic tradition. They were not instructed to kill Hiram Abif, but only to force the secret from him. Lomas and Knight even add the fascinating speculation based on Sequenenre's dates, that Apopi's Grand Vizier, who was behind the plot to force Sequenenre to divulge the secret ritual, was Joseph, son of Jacob, whose brothers sold him into slavery. They go further and speculate that 2 of the murderers were Joseph's brothers, Simeon and Levi. The third murderer, they believe, was a young priest of Sequenenre's temple, who was dragged into the plot with the threat that Apopi meant to destroy Thebes, and that the only way of averting this would be to divulge the god-making ritual. Lomas and Knight discovered some extraordinary physical evidence to support their theory. The mummified head of Sequenenre, as already noted, showed marks of violent blows, one of which had destroyed his eye. But entombed beside the pharaoh was another mummy whose state had baffled Egyptologists. Although the flesh had been mummified by the dry air of the tomb, the inner organs had not. As is usual when embalmed, he had been castrated and his face bore an expression of agony. He had clearly been wrapped in bandages while still alive, and had died of suffocation. There could be little doubt that this was one of the murderers of the pharaoh. The fact that he was killed so horribly and buried beside Sequenenre suggested that he was not a Hyksos, but some member of the pharaoh's entourage who was being punished for treachery. Treachery. The other 2 murderers, foreigners, would simply be executed. But why the castration? Because when the god Horus avenged the murder of his father Osiris in a battle with Set, Horus lost an eye, and Set lost his testicles. So to punish a treacherous priest in this way would be oddly appropriate, particularly since Sequenenre had lost his eye. Sequenenre's son, Kamos, avenged his father's murder by fomenting the rebellion that drove the Hyksos out of Egypt. Kamos became the founder of the new Egyptian dynasty, and the ritual of the murder and resurrection of Osiris, which would be used at his coronation, would be enriched by a new level of meaning. The death and resurrection of Sequenenre, whether the actual god-making ritual survived, is of course questionable. Five pages. Okay. If Lomas and Knight are correct in believing that the pharaohs who made Joseph the governor of Egypt was Apopi, and the dates seem to support it, then the murder of Sequenenre was of even deeper significance. For as we have seen, Joseph's father, Jacob, became Israel, the founder of the Jewish people. If Joseph and his family were among the Hyksos who were driven out of Egypt, then the murder of Sequenenre also created the Jewish nation. That would certainly help to explain why the murder of Sequenenre was regarded as so important by the Jews that it was transformed into the murder of Hiram Abif, the architect of Solomon's temple. Now we can begin to glimpse something of the bold and imaginative sweep of the theory put forth by Lomas and Knight. In researching the history of Freemasonry, they seem to have made a string of extraordinary discoveries. The identification of Hiram Abif, the Sequenenre, was only the first. With the murder of Hiram Abif, Egyptian mythology was metamorphosed into Jewish mythology, and this implies that some form of Freemasonry had survived from the time of Sequenenre, which involved a ritual death and resurrection. For me, this was further confirmed by Lomas and Knight's references to the prophet Enoch. In the Hiram Key, there are merely three brief references to him. Toward the end of its sequel, The Second Messiah, there is a passage about the 13th degree of Scottish Freemasonry, which quote, tells how in times long before Moses and Abraham, the ancient figure of Enoch foresaw that the world would be overwhelmed by an apocalyptic disaster through flood or fire, and determined to preserve at least some of the knowledge then available to man, that it might be passed on to future civilizations of survivors. He therefore engraved in hieroglyphics the great secrets of science and building onto two pillars, one made of brick and the other of stone. Quote, the Masonic legend then goes on to tell how these pillars were almost destroyed, but sections survived the flood and were subsequently discovered, one by the Jews and the other by the Egyptians. So according to the Masons, the origins of Freemasonry, the two pillars that play a central part in its rituals, can be traced back to Enoch. When I first read the Hiram Key, I assumed that this was simply another more or less fictional attempt to establish the ancient lineage of Freemasonry. But by the time I finished The Second Messiah, I was less inclined to be dismissive. It seemed to me that Lomas and Knight had made an extremely plausible case for the Egyptian origin of Freemasonry and for some secret knowledge that could be traced through Solomon's temple, the Essenes, and the Templars. Lomas and Knight also emphasized that the tradition of Enoch and the flood is of central importance to Masonry, and in their third volume, Uriel's Machine, Enoch is virtually the central character. As already noted, Lomas and Knight argue that the flood was caused by the impact of a comet in 7640 BC, and that the ancients were able to anticipate this impact by using Uriel's machine. There was also no less than 32 references to the planet Venus, which they explain, quote, symbolizes rebirth in Judaism, Freemasonry, and many other ancient traditions, end quote. We can see then a convergence of Masonic traditions and the arguments of this book about ancient civilization. Wow. Getting there, but damn, man. Long, stinking chapter. We can see then a convergence of Masonic tradition and the arguments of this book about ancient civilizations. To recap what we have discussed in this chapter, Lomas and Knight produced compelling evidence to suggest that the Egyptian ritual for which Sequenenre was murdered was one of the secrets of the Essenes. which was hidden beneath the temple after the crucifixion of Jesus, in whose story resurrection also plays a central part. The Essenes, who guarded the secret, were wiped out by Titus, and the temple was destroyed. Lomas writes of a ritual of Freemasonry that, quote, has a retrospect that tells of the fall of the Nazarenes in AD 70, and how the progenitors of Freemasonry left Jerusalem at that time to spread across Europe, end quote. Lomas also says that these survivors, quote, believed that they were preserving the bloodlines of the two messiahs of David and Aaron who would one day arrive and establish the kingdom of God on earth, end quote. Jesus, whom the Baptist Mandeans, descendants of the Essenes, regard as an impostor, was raised to the status of a god by St. Paul, and when Constantine used Christianity to bind his collapsing empire together, the resurrection became the church's most powerful claim to supernatural authority. It was this authority that would destroy most of the Templars. I'm going to stand up again. It was this authority that would destroy most of the Templars in 1307, but the Templar fleet escaped and some ships sailed to America. Other Templars went to Scotland, where an abbey named Kilwinning... Wait a minute. It's a repeat. Didn't we just read that? Well, I'll read it, but it seems like I'm repeating some stuff here. Oh, that's right, because it's a recap. Duh. Okay. Jesus, whom it was this authority that would destroy most of the Templars in 1307, but the Templars' fleet escaped and some ships sailed to America. Other Templars went to Scotland, where an abbey named Kilwinning had been built in the first great days of the Templar power around 1140. It was just south of Glasgow and was the Templars' major center. This would be a natural refuge, particularly since the St. Clair family lived not far away, in Roslin. Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland, as we have noted earlier, had been excommunicated by the Pope, so Templars had nothing to fear in Scotland. One of the main arguments of the hierarchy is that Roslin Chapel was built in deliberate imitation of Herod's temple, which, we may recall, was only about the size of a parish church, and as the home of the precious scrolls, which were the most important treasure of the Templars. They argue that even the unfinished outer wall at Roslin, which looks as if the building was simply abandoned at that point, was a replica of an unfinished wall in Herod's rebuilding of Solomon's temple. And what of the man who built the temple, Hiram Abiff? As I read Lomas and Knight on Hiram Abiff, I found myself thinking about another interesting connection. Hiram was, as noted, from Tyre, and having visited Tyre on a trip to Lebanon, I knew that it was a Phoenician city, and that the Phoenicians were not worshippers of Yahweh. Why would Solomon want a Phoenician architect? Presumably because Hiram of Tyre was the best man for the job. Okay, last 2 pages. All the same, it seemed odd. The chief Phoenician god was Baal, or Bel, whom the authors of the Old Testament regard with suspicion and dislike, and their leading female deity was Astarte, who also called Astoreth and Ishtar. In The Temple and the Lodge, which I have and I've been wanting to read, Michael Bejant and Richard Lay make an astonishing assertion that, quote, modern archaeological research confirms that Solomon's temple bears an unmistakable resemblance to the actual temples built by the Phoenicians, end quote. They go on, quote, it is even possible to go a step further. Tyrian temples were erected to the Phoenician mother goddess Astarte. Hilltops and mountains, Mount Hermon, for example, abounded with her shrines, end quote. And they point out that King Solomon is also described in 1 Kings 3 as offering sacrifice and incense on the high places. Lomas and Knight draw attention to the fact that Solomon's religion was not strictly orthodox. When he grew old, quote, his wives swayed his heart to other gods. Solomon became a follower of Astarte, end quote. Also 1 Kings 11. They even state that the famous Song of Songs is a hymn to Astarte. They then ask the astonishing question, quote, was the temple dedicated to the God of Israel, or was it dedicated to Astarte, end quote. The question may seem academic until we recall that Astarte was known to the Greeks as Aphrodite, the goddess of love, for which we get the term aphrodisiac, and to the Romans as Venus. So the man who built Solomon's temple was a worshipper of Venus, and his employer also had leanings in that direction. The pagan goddess must be regarded as the key to the next chapter of this strange story of ancient rituals. Venus is not only the goddess of love but of magic, and the reason for this is a striking peculiarity connected with its orbit that distinguishes it from all the other planets. If we imagine the Earth as the center of the solar system, as the ancients believed it was, it becomes obvious that there will be moments when every planet will be eclipsed by the sun, when the sun comes between the planet and the Earth. Mercury, for example, is eclipsed 3 times a year, and if we draw lines between these 3 points in the heavens, they form an irregular triangle. Mars is eclipsed 4 times, and the figure is an irregular rectangle. In fact, all the planets make irregular figures except Venus, and this makes a perfect 5-sided figure or pentagram. And if we draw a 5-pointed star inside the pentagram, the result is a figure known to every magician in history, the pentacle, a figure that is often used to symbolize man, since it seems to have 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head. A famous drawing of Leonardo da Vinci, the Vitruvian Man, shows a spread eagle man in the shape of a 5-pointed star. Venus is also the goddess who presides over the world's most ancient religion, nature worship. This was a religion practiced in Tyre, and of which King Solomon was an unlikely votary. According to the Freemasons, Solomon's temple was designed by a worshipper of Venus, Hiram of Tyre. The 9 knights who founded the Templars were undoubtedly Christians, not worshippers of Venus, but their subsequent history and the final destruction of the Templars makes it clear that they were certainly not believers in the Savior theory of St. Paul or in the Christianity of the Nicene Creed. They held the same religious beliefs as the unknown draftsman who drew the heavenly Jerusalem. To use a word that was not invented until William St. Clair built Rosslyn in 1554, they were Freemasons. But who were they? From whom did they inherit their ancient beliefs? A startling answer to that question was proposed in 1982 in a book called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail by Richard Lay, Michael Bejant, and Henry Lincoln. But although Lay and Bejant occupy the leading position on the title page, the man who stumbled upon this story was the third, Henry Lincoln. The story told of a village priest named Béranger Saunier, whose parish was in the Languedoc, north of the Pyrenees. He was very poor. His income was about £6 sterling a year, on which he supported himself and his housekeeper. The village was called René de la Château, which is where Mary Magdalene is reputed to be buried. But what all of this has to do with Atlantis and the kingdom of the Neanderthals, I have no clue. I don't know where the hell he's going with this. It makes no sense to me. He has not mentioned the Neanderthals, but twice, barely in passing. And now he's getting into all this Freemasons and Templars stuff, which I find very interesting, but it doesn't seem to have anything to do with what the book title says it's about. So I don't know what the hell to think. But we've got 3 more chapters to go. Thankfully, that one's over because that was a damn long chapter. And this next one at least has a couple of pictures in it. Bunch of stuff about the pentagram, the pentacle, the Fibonacci spiral. It looks like. Okay, it is 38 pages long. That's going to be another long one. I'm going to have to take a break in it. And then the next one, 27 pages. And the final one is 30 pages. So yeah, these are going to be some longer sessions. There is no way I'm going to try to do a gaming stream tonight after a 2-hour reading stream. So we will pick this up Sunday for the next chapter and see where we get with it. Probably won't do a gaming stream then unless I can start an hour earlier. If I can get started at 8:30, then maybe I will. But we'll get through it anyway. I will see you all. Actually, let's go see who have we got. No, I'm not going to rate anybody. I'm just going to end it. I will see you all next time. Tomorrow is Star Wars reading, which should be shorter than this one was, and Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. We'll continue with it. So, see you then.
Prepare to die.